What happens when a wealthy prince, tired of being loved for his title, trades his crown for a servant's garb to win the heart of a woman who despises wealth and pretense? In The Prince and the Servant, love, deception, and vulnerability collide in an unforgettable tale of trust, heartbreak, and redemption. Will true love conquer the weight of betrayal, or will secrets tear them apart forever? Dive into this heartwarming journey where the price of honesty is greater than any crown. The golden glow of the setting sun streamed through the vast stained glass windows of the royal palace, casting kaleidoscopic patterns on the marble floors. Prince Darius stood by the window, his reflection a pale, distorted image against the vibrancy of the world outside. He was dressed in a finely tailored coat, adorned with silver embroidery and gemstones, yet his gaze was fixed on the distant horizon. Beyond the palace gates, beyond the sprawling courtyards and manicured gardens, lay a world he longed to understand, a world unshackled by the weight of titles and pretense. Darius ran a hand through his dark, tousled hair and sighed deeply. The grand opulence that surrounded him felt like a gilded cage, suffocating and empty. His voice broke the silence, low and reflective. "Is this all there is?" he murmured to himself, his eyes tracing the flight of a bird soaring freely into the vast sky. He turned away from the window, his expression clouded by a mix of restlessness and melancholy. In the private study, Elias, the prince's trusted confidant, lounged in a chair, a smirk playing on his lips. The room was lined with shelves of leather-bound books and lit by the warm glow of a chandelier. Darius paced back and forth, his frustration evident in every step. "You're telling me," Darius said, his voice rising, "that every woman I meet looks at me and sees a crown, not a man?" Elias raised an eyebrow. "And this surprises you? You are the Crown Prince of Orleans, after all. The title comes with its complications." Darius stopped pacing and stared at Elias. "I want someone to love me for who I am, not for my wealth, not for my power. Just me." His voice cracked slightly, the vulnerability catching Elias off guard. Elias leaned forward, his smirk replaced by a thoughtful expression. "Well, if you want to be seen as just a man, you'll have to stop being the prince." Darius frowned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Elias said, standing, "that if you truly want to know what it feels like to be loved for yourself, then step out of the palace. Be someone else. Live incognito." The idea hung in the air, and Darius hesitated, the enormity of it settling in. Finally, he nodded, determination hardening his features. "I'll do it." The bustling sounds of the merchant's manor were a stark contrast to the quiet elegance of the palace. Horses clattered on cobblestone driveways as crates of goods were unloaded. Servants hurried about with baskets and trays, their movements efficient and purposeful. Darius, now clad in a plain tunic and trousers, stood awkwardly at the edge of the commotion, his hands calloused from a day of labor. He had never carried anything heavier than a ceremonial sword, and now his muscles ached from unloading barrels and hauling sacks of grain. A faint sheen of sweat clung to his brow as he adjusted to the rhythm of his new life. It was in this moment of disorientation that he saw her Layla. She was kneeling by the garden, tending to a bed of herbs with practiced ease. The sunlight caught the streaks of gold in her auburn hair as it spilled over her shoulders. She hummed softly to herself, a tune so gentle it seemed to soothe the chaos around her. Darius froze, his breath catching. She looked up and met his gaze, her hazel eyes sparkling with curiosity. For a moment, the noise of the manor faded, leaving only the soft hum of the wind and the rapid thrum of his heart. "You're new here," Layla said, rising to her feet and brushing dirt from her hands. Her voice was warm and unassuming. "Yes," Darius replied, his voice faltering slightly. He cleared his throat and managed to smile. "I'm a Darius. Just started today." She smiled back, a smile that felt like the first genuine connection he'd experienced in years. "Welcome, Darius. Don't let my father scare you off. He runs a tight ship." And with that, she returned to her work, leaving Darius standing there, his world suddenly feeling larger and more alive than it ever had within the palace walls. The wooden bucket slipped from Darius's grip, spilling water across the stone floor of the kitchen. A sharp gasp escaped from a nearby maid, who scrambled to mop up the mess before the head cook noticed. Darius muttered an apology, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. The prince, who had once commanded armies and addressed nobles, now fumbled with the simplest tasks. "Careful, Darius," scolded one of the senior servants, a wiry man with sharp eyes. "We don't have time to coddle you." Darius bit back a retort, reminding himself that he was no longer Prince Darius, heir to the throne, but merely a humble servant. His arms ached from carrying heavy crates of produce all morning. His back throbbed from scrubbing floors, and his dignity had taken more hits in a single day than in his entire life. In the chaos of the bustling kitchen, Layla appeared, carrying a tray of freshly baked bread. She paused when she saw him crouched by the spill, her expression softening. "Here," she said, kneeling beside him and offering her hand. "Let me help." Darius glanced up, startled. Most others had either ignored or scolded him throughout the day. Her kindness was a balm to his frayed nerves. Together, they cleaned the mess, their hands brushing briefly as they worked. Layla laughed lightly, a sound as warm as sunlight. "You'll get the hang of it," she said. "Everyone struggles at first." "I did too." "Really?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Of course. We're not born knowing how to do everything, are we?" she replied with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. As she walked away, Darius found himself smiling for the first time that day. He felt an unfamiliar warmth, one that made the aches and bruises almost worth it. That evening, Darius sat on a wooden stool in the dimly lit servants' quarters, staring at his calloused hands. They were a far cry from the smooth, unblemished hands of a prince. His body was exhausted, but his mind refused to rest. He thought of Layla, her laughter, her kindness, her natural grace. She was unlike anyone he had met in the royal court. There was no pretense, no calculation in her demeanor. For the first time, he felt seen not as a title, but as a person. But the guilt weighed heavily on him. He was deceiving her, lying about his identity. Was it fair to her? Was it honorable? His royal upbringing had ingrained in him a sense of duty and truth, and yet here he was, living a lie. He clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "This is the only way," he whispered to himself. "If I told her the truth now, she'd see me as the prince and nothing more. I need her to know me first for who I really am." Despite his justifications, a part of him wondered if he was only fooling himself. Was he testing her feelings or running away from his own fears? The next morning, the manor buzzed with excitement and preparation. Servants rushed to polish silverware, dust furniture, and arrange flowers in every room. The merchant, Layla's father, paced the main hall, barking orders. "What's going on?" Darius asked one of the servants. "A special guest," the servant replied with a hint of sarcasm. "Baron Alaric. He's here to court Layla." The words hit Darius like a blow to the chest. His mind reeled at the thought of another man pursuing her, especially someone like Alaric. Though he hadn't met the Baron, he'd heard the name whispered in royal circles, an ambitious and self-absorbed nobleman with a penchant for flaunting his wealth. Moments later, Baron Alaric strode into the manor, flanked by attendants. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his every movement exuding arrogance. Darius watched from the shadows as Layla greeted the Baron politely, but without warmth. Alaric wasted no time in attempting to impress her, boasting about his estates and his plans to expand his wealth. Layla listened politely, though her forced smile revealed her disinterest. Jealousy burned in Darius's chest. He clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. He knew he couldn't openly compete with Alaric, not as a mere servant. Yet the thought of Layla being swept away by someone so undeserving filled him with desperation. As Alaric laughed loudly at one of his own jokes, Layla glanced over her shoulder and caught Darius's eye. For a brief moment, her expression softened, and she offered him a small, almost apologetic smile. It was enough to reignite Darius's determination. He might not have a title or wealth to flaunt, but he had something far more important: his genuine feelings for her. And he wasn't about to give up. Not yet. The summer breeze rustled through the orchard as Darius carried a crate of ripe apples toward the storage shed. Layla walked beside him, her laughter filling the air as she recounted a story about her mischievous younger brother. Darius smiled, savoring these moments with her, each one a reprieve from the chaos of the manor and his own tangled emotions. "You don't talk much about yourself," Layla remarked, her tone light but curious. Darius hesitated, adjusting his grip on the crate. "There's not much to tell," he said carefully. "Just a simple life, moving from place to place." Layla tilted her head, studying him. "You don't seem like someone who's spent much time as a servant." Darius's heart raced, but he forced a chuckle. "I suppose everyone has to start somewhere." Their conversations grew deeper over the following days. Layla confided her frustrations about her father's obsession with status and her suitor's lack of authenticity. "They all care about appearances," she admitted one evening. "No one seems to understand the things that really matter: kindness, honesty, hard work." Hearing her disdain for shallow wealth filled Darius with hope. She valued what he wanted to be, not the prince he was born to. But their growing connection also deepened his guilt. Every moment with her was a reminder of the lie he was living. Meanwhile, Baron Alaric's presence loomed like a storm cloud. His relentless courtship of Layla, grand gifts, elaborate compliments, and bold declarations created a sense of urgency in Darius. Alaric's arrogance grated on Layla, but her father's approval of the Baron added pressure for her to consider his suit. Darius watched from the shadows as Layla endured Alaric's pompous monologues with polite indifference. The sight only strengthened his resolve. He couldn't let Alaric win her over, but the weight of his deception threatened to pull him under. Darius's clumsiness as a servant remained a source of amusement and frustration for the manor staff. One morning, as he struggled to balance a tray of teacups, the entire set crashed to the floor, shattering into pieces. The headmaid's sharp reprimand echoed through the hall, and Darius flushed with embarrassment. Layla appeared at the doorway, her brow furrowed. "It's just tea," she said calmly, stepping forward. "We'll clean it up. No need to make such a fuss." She knelt beside Darius, helping him pick up the shards. The warmth of her presence eased his humiliation, and their fingers brushed as they reached for the same piece of porcelain. She smiled, a small, reassuring gesture that sent his heart racing. "You'll get better," she said quietly. "It just takes time." Moments like these brought them closer, but each act of kindness from Layla deepened Darius's guilt. The longer he stayed, the harder it became to reconcile his growing love for her with the lie that underpinned their connection. He was terrified of losing her trust, but equally afraid of losing her altogether. One evening, Elias slipped into the servants' quarters unnoticed. He found Darius slumped on his cot, his head in his hands. "You look like a man in trouble," Elias said, his voice low. Darius sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can't keep doing this, Elias. Every day, I feel like I'm digging a deeper hole." Elias leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Then stop digging. Tell her the truth." Darius shook his head. "I can't. Not now. If she finds out, I'll lose her." Elias raised an eyebrow. "And what happens when she finds out later? Do you think this deception can last forever?" As their conversation ended, Darius was left with a sinking feeling. Elias was right. His time was running out. Meanwhile, Baron Alaric's suspicions about Darius grew. During one of his visits, he watched Darius with narrowed eyes, noting his confident posture and the ease with which he spoke to Layla. Alaric's disdain for the servant turned to curiosity, and he began discreetly questioning the other staff about Darius's background. The pressure mounted as Alaric's presence became more intrusive, and Darius struggled to maintain his facade. Layla's keen intuition began to uncover cracks in Darius's story. During a quiet moment in the garden, She asked him about his past. His vague answers and evasive demeanor only heightened her suspicion. "You're not telling me everything," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Who are you, really?" Darius's chest tightened. He searched for a response, but found none that wouldn't deepen the lie. "I just prefer to keep some things private," he stammered, avoiding her gaze. Layla nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I understand, but secrets have a way of coming to light." Her words lingered long after she left, leaving Darius to wrestle with the consequences of his choices. The walls of his deception were closing in, and he could feel the weight of the truth pressing against them, ready to burst. The grand feast was a spectacle of excess. The dining hall was adorned with golden candelabras, cascading floral arrangements, and silk-draped tables laden with sumptuous dishes. Guests in luxurious attire mingled and toasted to prosperity. At the head of the table sat Baron Alaric, his laughter booming as he regaled the crowd with tales of his exploits. Layla sat beside him, her polite smile a mask for her growing irritation. Darius stood along the wall with the other servants, his gaze flickering to Layla. She met his eyes briefly, and though her expression was unreadable, the moment filled him with both hope and unease. "Servant," Alaric barked, pointing at a nervous young maid carrying a tray of wine goblets. She approached cautiously, her hands trembling as she offered him a drink. Alaric took the goblet, then deliberately tipped it, spilling its contents across her apron. The room fell silent, the maid's face flushing with humiliation. "You should learn to serve properly," Alaric sneered. "Perhaps we'll train you with simpler tasks like fetching scraps from the dogs." Laughter erupted from some of the guests, but Darius stepped forward, his fists clenched. "That's enough." All eyes turned to him, the murmur of surprise rippling through the hall. Darius's voice was steady but firm. "She's doing her best. There's no need to humiliate her." Alaric's smile faltered, then turned into a sneer. "And who are you to lecture me, servant?" Darius stood his ground, his heart pounding. "A man who knows the value of respect." Layla's eyes widened, admiration flickering across her face. But Alaric, sensing a challenge, rose from his chair and strode toward Darius. He studied him closely, his gaze sharp and calculating. "There's something peculiar about you," Alaric said, his voice laced with suspicion. "You speak too well, carry yourself too confidently for a mere servant." The room held its breath as Alaric circled him, his smirk growing. "Let's put an end to this charade, shall we?" With a flourish, Alaric yanked Darius's shirt collar, revealing the fine stitching of his undergarment, a mark of royal tailoring. Gasps filled the room as realization dawned. "Prince Darius of Orleans," Alaric announced with mock triumph, hiding among the servants. "How noble of you." Layla's hand flew to her mouth, her expression a mix of shock and disbelief. Darius's chest tightened as he faced her, his voice breaking. "Layla, I can explain." But she turned and fled the room, leaving Darius standing in the midst of the stunned crowd. The garden was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of blooming roses. Darius found Layla sitting on a stone bench, her back to him. The moonlight cast a silver glow over her figure, highlighting the tension in her posture. "Layla," he began softly, his voice filled with remorse. She didn't turn around. "How long?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How long have you been lying to me?" He stepped closer, but kept his distance. "Since the beginning," he admitted. "But I never meant to hurt you. I wanted to know if someone could see me for who I really am, not what I am." She finally turned, her eyes glistening with tears. "And you thought deception was the way to do that? You made me trust you, care for you, while you kept the truth hidden." "I was afraid," he said, his voice cracking. "Afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd see the prince, not the man." "Layla, I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone." Her tears spilled over as she stood, her hands clenched at her sides. "Do you even realize what you've done? You took away my choice, my ability to decide for myself whether I wanted to trust you." How can I believe anything you say now? Darius reached for her, but she stepped back. Please, he begged. Give me a chance to make this right. Everything I've said, everything I've felt, it's real. I love you. She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can believe that. Not anymore. With that, she walked away, leaving Darius standing alone in the garden, the weight of his choices crashing down on him. He sank onto the bench, his head in his hands, as the faint sound of her footsteps faded into the night. The next morning, Layla sat by her bedroom window, the sunlight streaming across her face. Her tear-streaked cheeks glowed softly as she stared out at the garden where the confrontation had taken place. Her father's insistence on entertaining Baron Alaric's suit weighed on her mind, but it was the memory of Darius's vulnerability, his pleading words that consumed her thoughts. She replayed every moment of their time together, his clumsy attempts at servant life, his quiet kindness, and the way he had stood up for others, even when it risked everything. Despite her anger, she couldn't deny the sincerity in his eyes. There was a truth to his feelings, even if they had been shrouded in deceit. Meanwhile, Darius stood in the palace throne room, facing his father, King Leopold. The grandeur of the space felt colder than ever, the towering marble columns and gilded statues a stark reminder of the life he had been born into but no longer wanted. I cannot continue living this way, Darius declared, his voice steady but resolute. The king frowned, his expression a mix of disappointment and confusion. You would abandon your duties? Your birthright. I would abandon a life that doesn't allow me to be true to myself, Darius replied. If I am to rule, I need to be a man of integrity, and that begins with owning my mistakes. I need to show Layla I'm more than the title she resents. The king's expression softened, though his tone remained firm. And what if she doesn't forgive you? Then at least I'll know I tried, Darius said, but I can't ask for forgiveness without proving I'm worthy of it. Darius renounced many of his royal privileges that day, including the riches and estates tied to his name. He took a small retinue of supplies and rode to the manor, prepared to make amends. When he arrived, Layla was waiting in the garden, her expression guarded but curious. Darius dismounted and approached her, carrying nothing but a simple satchel. I've given it all up, he said, meeting her gaze. The wealth, the titles, everything. I don't want a life where I have to hide who I am or force someone else to do the same. I just want to be someone worthy of your trust. Layla studied him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of pretense. Slowly, her expression softened. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, he said earnestly, because I love you, and I needed you to know that I'm willing to fight for us. On equal ground, with no lies. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. It'll take time, she said, her voice trembling, to rebuild what we lost. I'll wait as long as it takes, he promised. Just tell me there's a chance. Layla hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward and taking his hand. There's a chance. The sun dipped low on the horizon as Darius and Layla walked side by side along a cobblestone path in a quiet village. The distant hum of life surrounded them, children playing, the chatter of merchants, the occasional bark of a dog, but the world felt serene and unhurried. Darius carried a small basket of fresh bread they had bought at the market, his smile soft and content. Layla held a bundle of wildflowers, their bright colors a reflection of the hope blossoming between them. They spoke of simple things, the day's errands, the charm of the village, but their laughter carried the warmth of deeper understanding. As they passed a quaint cottage with ivy creeping up its walls, Layla paused and turned to Darius. Do you ever miss it? She asked, her tone curious. The palace. Darius shook his head. Not for a moment. He looked at her, his gaze steady and full of conviction. This us is all I need. Layla smiled, her fingers intertwining with his. Together, they continued down the path, their steps in perfect harmony. The camera lingered on their retreating figures, framed by the golden hues of the setting sun. What would you do for love? Would you be willing to give up everything to find what truly matters? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories.